Welcome everyone to tonight's forum with special guest and returning emerita faculty member Stephanie Coontz, who's a widely known author and educator. I'm Sarah Ryan. I'm the Dean of Evening and Weekend Studies at Evergreen. I'm an Evergreen alum who returned to school here in 1990 in my late 30s. You can do the math. It was a really wonderful experience. I then came back to teach several years later. I've taught labor studies in the evening and weekend studies curriculum for years, and I'm just currently on a temporary assignment as Dean of Evening and Weekend Studies. So I want to welcome you all, whether you're alumni, community guests, or current students in our evening and weekend program. First, I want to acknowledge the special place that we're in tonight. The Longhouse is an education and cultural center. It's a house of welcome to all peoples, but it's a special project of Northwest Tribes and the college. It's celebrating its 20th anniversary. It has a very unique place in the region. I hope you enjoy the collection of art that's here while you're a guest in the Longhouse. And it's founded on a vision of hospitality and service. It's a public service center of the college, so it's meant for outreach and welcoming. And we want the Longhouse sponsors gatherings of Native artists nationally, internationally, and regionally. And it's a very important place. Please do not smoke in the Longhouse or stand outside the front and smoke. There's a smoking shelter down the hill to your left if you really need to take a break that way. So tonight we're gathering students, alumni, and community members for a forum with Stephanie Coontz, and the title of her talk tonight is The Way We Never Were, How Myths About America's Past Threaten Our Future. The forum is sponsored, and it's a project of the Evening and Weekend Studies program at Evergreen. Evening and Weekend Studies is a part of the college that allows working adults to get a Bachelor of Arts degree while attending during the evenings and weekends. And we're also the home to a wide variety of hands-on courses in the visual arts, in world languages, in studio arts, and various lab sciences. Our Evening and Weekend Studies outreach coordinator, brand new, is Ray Mobley. He's at a table in the back, waving there. And you can meet him. He's relatively new as an admissions counselor, but he's an Evergreen alum and veteran, and he is newly on the job doing outreach to veterans and evening and weekend students. So I want to see who's here. How many of you make some noise or applaud if you're students in Evergreen's evening and weekend programs? Okay. All right. Great. How many of you are Evergreen graduates? Yay. How many of you are community members who may have read some of Stephanie's books? Not bad. So each year, Evening and Weekend Studies convenes a big community conversation about an important public question. And we invite a guest who's made important contributions to public life. Stephen Beck is a faculty member at Evergreen who has taught here since 1997. He is an Evergreen alum, again, very loyal. He was actually Stephanie's teaching assistant in a program called Hidden Histories of Europe. And he graduated from Brown University with a PhD in philosophy in 1994. And he's going to introduce the idea of the Liberal Arts Forum tonight, and then we will get right to Stephanie's talk.
Forgive me, I'm going to read this. If I don't, then I'm afraid I'll go on forever, so it's best if I do that. Welcome to Evening and Weekend Studies Liberal Arts Forum. Welcome to members of the Evergreen community, to members of the Olympia and South Sound community, but most especially, welcome to Evening and Weekend Studies students. This is you Evergreen Evening and Weekend Studies students are the reason that we have this liberal arts forum. We do this for your sake. You are studying in your separate programs in a wide, diverse area of a liberal arts curriculum. You're studying biology, environmental studies, government, business, Native American studies, chemistry, writing, communication, sociology, health, law, civic intelligence, literature, cultural studies, history, political economy, theater, and of course, philosophy. That's just a few, and if I left a few out, then forgive me, but I'd be going on at too great a length if I were to list them all. But you're studying several programs in these, several of these areas in your program. But we in Evening Weekend Studies recognize the importance of coming together as a community. The forum is an opportunity for you to meet other Evening Weekend Studies students and Evening Weekend Studies faculty. It's an opportunity for you to reflect on your own developing liberal education in a broader context than your own program. It's an opportunity for you to think about the implications and the value of what you're studying in relation to our present moment in history. It's an opportunity for you to take what you are learning in your program and to put it to use, together with others, what others are learning, so as to come to a better understanding, a shared understanding of the specific conditions of our society. It's an opportunity for you to listen to, discuss the work of, and ask questions of a groundbreaking scholar, an expert on a matter of central importance in our society, and one whom I had the good fortune to be a student of and a teaching assistant of. For we in Evening and Weekend Studies recognize that to pursue a liberal education is to pursue a life in which you thoughtfully, skillfully, and ethically engage in the public life of our society. It is to live not only a reflective life, but a life of commitment to and action for the common good. We also recognize the pursuit of a liberal education as a lifelong pursuit. And that's evident by all of the members of the Evergreen and the South Sound community that are present tonight. So tonight we come together to continue and to extend all of our liberal educations. So I'd like to once again welcome or bring Sarah Ryan, Dean of Evening Weekend Studies, back to the podium to introduce our speaker.
So Stephanie Coontz has taught at Evergreen since 1974. Until five? Oh, even older. I actually met her in 1973, but that's a long story for another time. She has been a presence at the college, bringing public dialogue about critical histories, about re-examining histories of the family ever since that time. She has involved students in her historical research. She has trained other good historians who have gone on to open up difficult topics and re-examine what we thought we knew of history. And her book, The Way We Never Were, American Families in the Nostalgia Trap, came out in 1992 and really put her on the map as a public intellectual and somebody who gave people that aha experience when they realized that the history they had taught to believe, the past that they thought was eternally true, was actually quite different than it was made out to be. And her work has taught people to re-examine and not take for good coin stereotypes and myths about the past. The book's title comes from, most of you are probably too young to remember this film. There was this film called The Way We Were. And it had a theme song that was a top 40 hit. It was a very, very sappy theme song. For a movie that was a love story about kind of a happy-go-lucky, feckless, pretty boy jock, and a communist firebrand. So, considering the material of the movie, the song was very sentimental and referred to misty watercolor memories of the way we were. And people's ideas about the past of the American family and the past of everyday social life in the United States were no more distinct and useful than misty watercolor memories. There were misty watercolor histories without much detail, but histories that kept us from living life more fully in the present. So Stephanie stepped into the fray by re-examining the myths of the history of the family, that there was one kind of traditional family that dominated all eternity until the current era when things just went to heck in a handbasket because the traditional family declined. Stephanie is the author of 6 books, The Way We Never Were, The Way We Really Are, The Social Origins of Private Life, which predated the previous 2, Marriage, a History, A Strange Stirring, Feminine Mystique in American Women at the Dawn of the 1960s, and American Families, a Multicultural Reader. And a new edition of her book, The Way We Never Were, American Families in the Nostalgia Trap, will be coming out at the end of March. And you will be able to have the opportunity to come back and hear her talk about that work, hosted by the library and bookstore during spring quarter. So she's a frequent contributor to the New York Times, Washington Post. Today there was an article in the Post about divorce rates and myths behind the social esteem held by people who are single or married. She's been on all sorts of popular media, from Al Jazeera to Oprah to CNN to King 5. And though she's retired as a member of the faculty at Evergreen, she's probably busier than ever, and has a very demanding publication, personal appearance, media, and organizational schedule with the Council on Contemporary Families. She also has many other fascinating qualities that we can't go into tonight, but I'll just say that when I called her to talk about the details for the Liberal Arts Forum, she had just come back from surfing. So, Stephanie.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. I could not have done the work that I do in public life without having taught at Evergreen, with its interdisciplinary coordination, learning from other faculty members, learning from my students, and not having the pressure of a publish or perish place where you had to turn out little articles all the time. They gave me 12 years to work on my first book, and it was that book that then paved the way for The Way We Never Were. So I'm just very grateful to Evergreen. Of course, after all these years teaching here, I'm a little spoiled in terms of having enough time for lectures and seminars, and they've asked me to keep my opening remarks to 30 minutes, so I'll be galloping through. And of course, when you're being asked to talk about myths about American families, there are so many that it's just hard to choose between them. So I thought I'll throw out just a couple that if you want to ask me in the question period more about, we can. But I wanted to focus on 2 or 3 that really come up in today's political debates, and that really, I think, stand in the way of our making progress to build upon the gains that we've made and to take on the problems that we have. But just things that we can talk about. For example, the myth of what is the traditional family. You know, that one man, one woman. Well, actually, no. The most culturally preferred family form in history was one man, several women, although there were many others as well. The male breadwinner family was probably the least traditional family in all of history. It lasted for a mere 50 years. For the rest of human history, all family members were co-providers. There's the question of what is the purpose of marriage. I went through several myths of that on my own. I was taught the myth in college that marriage was invented to protect women and children. Then, as the feminist movement came along and we learned that marriage actually did not always protect women and children, and in fact that it often exploited them, I went through another theory that marriage was invented to oppress women and children, and I now think that marriage was invented to had nothing to do with the relationship between the nuclear family members. It was invented to get in-laws. So there's, of course, the myth of a stricter sexual moral past than we have today, that people were more sexually virtuous and moral. Oh boy, is that wrong. Or the myths that I'm right now writing on with African American History Month, the myths about black families, and specifically one that even researchers fall into, the idea that you can somehow control for the economic and socioeconomic differences between blacks and whites in this country, and therefore conclude that many of the distinctive family patterns among black Americans come from their distinctive cultural and racial traditions, when in fact, I think you can make a very strong argument, and I'm trying to make it in my next op-ed, that they come from America's distinctive racist traditions. And then finally, another one that we can get into if we like is the rise of single parenthood, which is supposedly the cause of increases in poverty and crime. Something that or the one that's being touted now by politicians, the success syndrome. The success sequence, that if you get an education, at least in high school, and then get a job, and then get married, that's the sure way out of poverty. Well, that's a description of people who are already successful. It is not a recipe for success. So we can get into all of these. But I want to talk about a few that I think really do threaten our ability to move forward. One is the myth of self-reliance. This is one of the most strong myths in American history, the idea that families never used to ask for handouts, that they always stood on their own 2 feet and pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Now, have any of you ever tried that? I mean, it is physically impossible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Reminds me, I heard a politician talking the other day about how there wasn't enough of a work ethic and you needed to put your nose to the grindstone. Now, that's somebody who never had an industrial job. You can put your shoulder to the grindstone. Putting your nose there would not get much work done, and it would really hurt your nose. You probably wouldn't have one left. But at any rate, this is a very, very persistent myth in American history. How many of you read the Little House on the Prairie series or watched it on TV? Yeah, it's still really, really popular. I come from a pioneer family in Washington, and my grandpa loved that, used to tell me. But most people don't know that this Laura Ingalls Wilder, her daughter rewrote all of her drafts of her memoirs of growing up in what was it, Kansas? I forget right now, or Dakota, one of these places. And her daughter was a real right-wing ideological opponent of the New Deal, who just completely thought that anything government did was wrong. So she systematically crossed out all of the parts of the memoir that talked about the family's reliance on neighbors, on government, and on outside help. For example, one favorite chapter that my grandpa used to read to me was about how the family scrimped and saved to send Laura to school. In the original version, Laura pointed out that the government had given her the tuition and the books to go to school, but that gets dropped from the Little House on the Prairie. And in fact, you know, right now we've got, well, actually my own grandfather, who was one of the earliest settlers in Tumwaters and moved to Hoquiam, was a logger, had a shake mill. and later moved out across from now what's Miller Sylvania State Park, land that I live on now because it's come down in the family. Whenever he would take me out to see that land that he bought very, very cheap during the Depression after it had all been logged, he would talk, he would talk about how he had saved for it, and we never asked for handouts and all that stuff. Perhaps he didn't know that the land came so cheaply because it was part of the federal subsidy that was originally allotted to the railroad companies, who received 183 million acres of the public domain given to them by the government in return for building the railroads, generally in alternating square mile sections onto a depth of 10 miles on either side. Those giveaways to the railroad, they then sold to the logging companies, and when the logging companies, they figured the land would last forever, they sold it off cheaply to those settlers who could afford it. So all of this was subsidized by the government. The end, in fact, is that the U.S. West could never have been settled without huge federal land grants, government-funded military mobilizations that took half of Mexico and defeated the Native Americans and dispossessed them, and state-sponsored economic investments in the new land. The Homestead Act of 1862, which allotted 160 acres to settlers, that they could buy 160 acres for $10. And that was a lot less than the government had paid to get those 160 acres. So Western settlement depended upon federal funding of exploration, development, transportation, communication systems. And then in the 20th century, the New Deal that Rose Wilder Lane hated so much provided a new form of subsidy, the construction of dams and other federally subsidized irrigation projects that brought pumps and refrigeration and household technology to tens of thousands of families who could not possibly have purchased those on the open market. They wouldn't have been on the open market if it hadn't been for the government. And even today, farmers pay only a few dimes on the dollar for what it costs to irrigate their field, and a few cents on the dollar for the grazing rights that allow them to build up the large herds that they use. And this is what you've got these people right down here, holed up in the Wildlife Reserve in Oregon, who think that they have some constitutional right to take that land from the public, even though the Constitution specifically reserves federal land, and every state that entered the Union passed an enabling act explaining that they gave up all right to the public land that had not been already distributed by the federal government. So it's just a lie, and yet it is a lie that has allowed these people to evade millions of dollars in grazing fee and hold up. And imagine if it was black Americans holed up there building defenses and threatening the FBI that way. It's just insane and ridiculous. So anyway, those frontier farmers were probably received first prize for the most heavily dependent, the most heavily subsidized families in history, although the hardworking male breadwinner family of the 1950s certainly comes a close second. The 1950s suburban family was very much dependent on government assistance. They got much more government assistance than any so-called underclass family today, or one of those people that supposedly are waiting around for free stuff, the takers versus the makers kind of theme. And by makers, they are referring to the people who make huge corporate profits, I assume, not to the people who make our beds and make our coffee and make our trains run on time and our buses run on time. But if federal GI benefits were available to 40% of the male population after the World War II, and they paid $500 a year for tuition, which doesn't sound like much, but that would cover tuition at even the most exclusive private colleges in those days. Federal GI benefits for the National Defense Education Act, retooled science education, government-funded research, developed the aluminum clapboard, the prefabricated walls, and ceilings and the paneling that formed the technological basis of the post-war housing revolution. Federal government spent all of the money that created in the highway system, that created new jobs for blue-collar workers, and allowed people to get to those suburban houses and set up their families. And by the way, the internet did not start in some teenager's garage. The internet was a result of the arms race between Russia and the United States. And the military needed to find some way to speed up the calculations that were needed to accurately fire intercontinental ballistic missiles. So in those days, of course, computers were just huge. They were these big mainframe computers, and government had helped fund some of them, many of them around at universities. But they were not set up to communicate with each other, and they were built to different specifications. So the government scientists had to work really hard to invent whole new protocols to allow those computers to communicate with themselves. If that had been funded by private industry, Facebook, Twitter, all the social media that I don't really understand, but that many of you rely on, would not possibly exist because private industry did not have the funds and would not have had the incentive to build it in ways so that they could all piggyback off each other. The whole point of private competitive industry is to make it the planned obsolescence, the difference, the thing that you have to buy separately. So this is such a tremendously destructive myth in our country when we think about the fact that we believe that only poor people get handouts, when in fact it is the basis of every successful family story in the United States. I could go into the the federal government's involvement in housing, which allowed the tremendous expansion of home ownership, and which only began to turn sour after the government backed off of its regulatory and allowed a lot of it to be privatized. The problem with these programs is not that they didn't work. It's that they worked so well for recipients that non-recipients were left far behind and are still paying for that today. The general public financed roads that suburban commuters used to get home, that companies used to deliver their goods across the highway, but the streetcars and trolleys that served urban and poor families got almost no tax revenues. Our previously thriving rail system was allowed to decay. Federal loan policies went to upwardly mobile white families, but they also, and they were a tremendous benefit to working class white families, but they also systematically they systematized and formalized the pervasive but informal racism that had previously characterized the housing market, with FHA redlining policies that made entire urban areas ineligible for loans, urban renewal, and investment only in new building that made it impossible to repair decaying infrastructure in the cities, and later has begun to boomerang even on the suburban areas who no longer get those kind of tax breaks for repairs, but only to go out. You see the tip of the iceberg, of course, in Flint, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. For those who got those subsidies, there are tremendous benefits. Also, and this occasionally makes me a little nostalgic. I was looking up some statistics. This was a period when 30% of the workforce was unionized. Real wages were rising hand in hand with productivity. So every time that productivity increased, real wages rose. The average working class man was making 4 times what his father made at that age in real dollars in the post-war period between 1947 and 1970. The investment in infrastructure was 3 times higher than today. And all of this did not encourage the laziness or family decay that we are now told is the result of getting handouts or help-outs. What a difference just a word makes when you make the distinction. It actually increased people's commitment to work and family. Not that I'm romanticizing the family values of that day. I mean, I've done enough studies of the racism, the sexism, as late as the 1960s, the head and master laws that prevailed, much higher levels of child abuse, infanticide, domestic violence than today. But the point is that these were things that we could overcome and started to overcome with the women's movement and with the civil rights movement. But unfortunately, after some progress in that, we've also seen a real retrogression in terms of the workers' ability to earn real wages and the ability of working people to capture a fair share of the things that they produce. But it did produce, the 1950s produced very strong families. The family values that they produced and that have since come to be seen as traditional, however, were kind of a different story. And this is the second myth that I want to take a little time to talk about today. How am I doing on time? 15. Okay, I'll gallop you through here. First of all, contrary to myth, the United States was not founded as a Christian nation. In fact, Jefferson, in his autobiography, explains that the Virginia Assembly talked about, when it passed the Freedom of Religion bill, had an amendment by somebody saying that it had under the authority of Jesus Christ. And the majority of the Assembly rejected that because they wanted to make sure that they were open to all religions. Some of them were actually atheists. But the point is that it was not a Christian nation. And even if it were, there is so much misunderstanding. There are so many people who have only read the passages of the Bible that their ministers or their television gurus point to and haven't read the Bible at all. You know, you get a lot of people who've read Leviticus and all that. But what about the fact that Jesus was actually quite anti-family? What does he say to his followers? If you do not hate and leave your father, your mother, your wife, and follow me and build the larger Christian community, then you are no disciples of mine. When one of his disciples asks leave to attend his father's funeral, what does he say? Anyone remember? Let the dead bury the dead. That's kind of mean, you know. When he is crucified on the cross, he doesn't reassure his mother standing in the crowd that he loves her and she was always wonderful to him, as I would like my son to do if, you know, I was dying somewhere. No, he says, dear woman, he points to one of his disciples, here is your son. And nor does he say to the disciple, take good care of my mother, you know, I'm going to be missing her. He just says, here is your mother. The Christian tradition was not the kind of pro-family, pro-nuclear family, pro-marriage family. And the earliest evangelicals in America were huge supporters of a much broader conception of Christian charity than the kind that we hear so often today, and that says you just take care of yourself because tax cuts. Let's give tax cuts to people so they can take care of their family. Or as by what I now think of as the first Gilded Age, as you know, the forecast of the one we have now, Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, who had really been, before the Civil War, one of the radical evangelicals who subscribed to the idea that your main task should be to combat social sins like slavery, not solitary sins, got a change of heart, and he started to say that, in fact, he specifically had a specific quote, that you should totally invest just in your own family, not in larger social movements. He says the family is the digesting order of the body politic. Money contributed there is contributed to the whole. This was a total reversal of the original Christian evangelical tradition. And of course, it forecasts the idea that if instead of building childcare, instead of investing in early preschool, we just give people tax deductions and never mind that the poor don't benefit from tax deductions because they don't have enough money to take it. If you look at the family values of our founders too, they also were quite different. Most people don't realize this, but the phrase family values, far from being traditional, first entered the public conversation during the 1976 election. The 1776 tradition was quite different. Jefferson's definition of values was to love your neighbor and your country more than yourself. John Adams argued that the foundation of a virtuous republic has to be a positive passion for the public good, superior to all private passions and commitments, and that no man owns himself in a republic. They are all property of the group. Honor and virtue were originally political words, not sexual ones. They described an individual's civic altruism, especially the willingness to take on political responsibilities beyond the household. Describing someone as a private person or a family man was not a compliment. In fact, now our founders did have some differences, but you can't cherry pick them, as most of our politicians do. Jefferson, for example, was a big believer in small government, but he was also a believer in reducing wealth to a state of what he called mediocrity, and he even proposed a progressive income tax. Hamilton was a great defender of private property, but he was also a great defender of a strong and energetic government. That's the problem with nostalgia for the past. When I sometimes feel nostalgia. I was listening to some of these debates, you know, and they're asked about climate change, and they say, "I'm not a scientist." Eisenhower didn't say that. He got a science advisor and brought him in. Nixon didn't say that when he signed the Clean Air Act and the Environmental Protection Agency. Reagan didn't say that when he said that climate change was one of our pressing priorities. So the fact that I can feel nostalgic for the wage and the union trends of the 1950s and 60s doesn't mean that I think we can go back to them, because we have to take the package deal. That's the problem with these myths that we hear. So one of the things that I think is just so important for us is to understand that nostalgia for the past, nostalgia is a very human emotion. You know, if you give kids they've done these studies. When kids come back from summer vacation, they ask them to list all the good things and the bad things about their vacation. And at first, the list is equally long. But if the list is asked to be repeated through the year, the bad things get shorter and shorter, and the good things actually get longer. Well, that's not so bad, you know. I mean, that kind of nostalgia is kind of good, you know, if it makes the kids forget the fighting in the car and think that they really did enjoy the vacation more than they did. But the kind of nostalgia that we are seeing in this country, particularly right now, I think, in this kind of period, is very different from that, because it is taking people's legitimate discomfort with some of the trends that we are seeing and telling them that the way to solve that discomfort, the way to make things better, is to go back to a past. They cherry pick something from it that they like, and they don't admit that it's impossible to go back, and that if we could go back, we would not like the whole package deal. What we're faced with now, and I'll just end with this in a very brief way, and that we can talk about it more in the discussion period. What we're faced with is a very interesting juxtaposition. We have made huge gains since the 1950s and 60s in terms of our acceptance of social tolerance, of the ideal of social equality. When I was writing that book back in 1991, only 48% of Americans approved of interracial marriage. Now 90% of them say they approve. You know, there's still a lot of racism, but that's a big change. Now we have an affluent group of African Americans, the Americans who are really accepted in society in a way that 40 years ago, 50 years ago, they weren't. That women have made extraordinary gains in legal rights, in social acceptance, in economics. male-female relationships are more democratic, less volatile, less violent than they ever were in the past. Gays and lesbians, look at the stunning turnaround in support for same-sex marriage, now even being extended to transgendered individuals. Huge, huge changes in attitudes. But at the same time, that rubs against this increasing inequality that we have in our society. And it leads to all sorts of contradictions that you see, for example, I'm particularly thinking about Black History Month now, where not only do you have this, actually have an income gap among blacks that is just as big, and higher income residential segregation among blacks, which used to be much lower than whites, than you used to have, making it much more searing for the people who are in the poorest communities, but also giving so many politicians an excuse to say, well, that if some people have ascended, there must be some cultural baggage or something that is holding the other people back. We see this over and over again, this turning, this taking of these progressive new social ideals of equality and using them to blame the people who have not been able to take advantage of the new opportunities for the few that we see in this economy, but have in fact been caught in the downward drain that is happening to the many in this economy. So it's so important that we look at these myths very critically. And I know that we're going to turn now to a small discussion, and then we can pursue this more. You asked me to come up with a question. I know you have your own questions, but to me, I would just say that maybe you could think about or talk about yourself if you see any myths of these myths or other myths in your own field of study, in your own work, or just your own social networks. And what do you see as the main challenges or opportunities that these myths present to us? How do we deal with them without just standing and saying no, 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 which doesn't actually win anybody over? How do we convince people to listen, to think about their myths and to see what's going wrong with them? Okay.
Thank you. We'll have lots more time. We'll have lots more time with Stephanie, but we figured you'll be able to listen better if you get a chance to talk first. Now, believe me, very interesting people have come to this forum tonight. Very interesting people. And I know that you alumni are starved for a seminar. So here's what we're going to do. I'd like my ushers to come up to the front row. We're going to have a brief discussion period. We're going to organize you into small groups to talk about the questions you have on the half sheet of paper. And we'll take a half an hour to do that, and then you will come up with a group question for Stephanie, and we'll reconvene for a discussion. So the ushers will ask the first row to turn around and face the second, and the third to face the fourth. And I'll let you know when 30 minutes is up, and then we will have a vibrant question and answer period with Stephanie.
Hi, Julia. Hi, Stephanie. My name is James, and our group, we came up with a question through reading your essay. A couple of your essays, we noticed that you kept coming back to the notion that we need more access to secondary education, undergraduate education, to help, bring people out of poverty, to have escapes, ways to get out of it. So we just want to ask, your thoughts on how we could do that as a society.
Well, let me modify that a little bit, because I think that we also need a situation, for example, something along the lines that they have in Germany, where if people do not want or do not feel cut out for secondary education, you can still get good jobs, you can do apprenticeships. I think it's very important that we not give in to the idea that everybody has to have it. There are lots of jobs that don't require a college education. There are lots of other ways of learning, and those jobs are worthwhile jobs that should be paid a living wage. Having said that, I do think that we've got to, first of all, we have to start early. We have to invest in early preschool. We have to, the inequality of education in this country is just not unmatched in any other wealthy country. Our top 20% does very well. But we think that a lot of that inequality comes from the socio and economic inequality, the much higher poverty rates that we have, the much higher incident of neighborhoods of totally concentrated and therefore magnified poverty. I said the Flint, lead, things like lead, pollutants, some of these communities are put in areas that have literally toxins all over them. So you've got this kind of problem with kids, and it just gets exacerbated by the lack of preschool, the lack of quality childcare, summer school. You've got financial stress, which we know interferes with parenting, that even parents who would ordinarily be able to spend more time with their kids and when they're under financial stress do not do so. And so you just got to go up from there, including standardizing our schools so that it's not a question of, this paying for it by the taxes means that the wealthy neighborhoods have much better schools. And then when we get to college, I think that we need to find a way of financing college for lower income students, and perhaps making it, as many European countries do, free. Perhaps that might include asking for some kind of public service afterwards. I'm not opposed to that. I'm not that kind of libertarian. But it's a long process, and the things we have to invest in, but other countries are able to do it and have been able to do it. Excuse me, I'm freezing here, so I stole Sarah's coat.
Hello. Our group talked about myth and how we sort of wanted to know if you could give us any insight about what sort of makes a myth stick and how that relates to the success of the myth and also the purpose or goal of the myth, which sort of assumes a utility of myths, but maybe that's an assumption you're comfortable making.
The last sentence again?
We're just curious about the success and the purpose of the myth and how that relates to the longevity of it. So,
I don't feel very competent to answer that. I know that America, because of our peculiar history of where we essentially kind of threw off the more collective, communal, historical rootedness of the European societies, and we overcame and conquered the native societies that had their own degrees of rootedness. We are particularly susceptible to these ideals of self-reliance, and when we look on a cultural scale at these kind of myths, they're particularly strong in America. So I think that I really don't know how to understand, though, what makes a particular myth stick. I do a lot of work in my public speaking and thinking about public speaking about how you go about answering ideas and how you go about talking about these kinds of things. And I think it's really important for all of us to discuss these kinds of answers. I'll tell you, for example, I'm not a fan of the of the phrase white privilege. I think it's accurate, but I find it very difficult to go to a group of white working class men whose real wages have been falling and say to them, you know, you're experiencing white privilege. I can usually talk them into understanding that they have had leverage because of the racism, because of the way that the latter has allowed them to stand on the shoulders of African Americans and other minorities. But when you use a word like privilege, I think in a sense you are showing that you have privilege, that you experience it as privilege. So I think words are very important, and of trying to approach people from a place where you can make them not feel defensive about the myth that you're going to attack is an extremely important way of proceeding. I know let me tell you a little story. When I first started talking about these kind of things, when The Way We Never Were came out, I'd go on these radio shows, and you know, I would. At the time, it was right after Dan Quayle's talk about, you know, Murphy Brown and all of these. So I was always get questions about the 1950s family and wasn't it better? And so I would rattle off all these facts, you know, and I would just demolish the idea that the 1950s families were better. And then the callers would come in and basically they would say I was crazy. And, you know, they just, and I was like puzzled. It was like, I know all these facts and I've told them all these facts, and why are they getting mad at me? So I went home and I started listening to the tapes because I realized that I should apply to my public speaking the same idea that I have in my teaching, which is that if 10% of the class doesn't get what I'm saying, that might be their problem. But if any more than that don't get what I'm saying, it is my problem. So I started listening to the tapes, and I realized that what people were hearing, now I wasn't saying it as baldly as this, but what they were hearing is they had this anxiety, and they heard this professor saying, I'm a professor, I know a lot more than you do, and you're anxious about all these changes that are going on in families, and you have had some bad personal experiences, but you're just stupid, and I'm going to humiliate you by showing you how much more that I know than you do. So I thought, well, that's pretty counterproductive. That's not working too well. So I said to myself, well, how can I, without pandering to them, find a common ground, find some acknowledgement, you know, that I understand where their anxiety comes from. And so, for example, when somebody would come in and tell me how much better the 1950s were, I would say, I could remember some things of my own. I say, you know, I actually understand where you're coming from. For example, I said, you know, when I was a kid in the 50s, I remember going to the library once, and I wanted to check out Of Mice and Men, you know, hardly a really pornographic book, and the librarian just had a fit and told me, I couldn't do it. And I went up to my mom, and I was crying because I was a very sensitive little girl. And he was just as small as I, and she puffed up like a little banty hen and walked down to the librarian, and she said, don't you ever tell my daughter she can't check out any book she wants, you know. And I said that was a really wonderful, empowering thing, but I would not go to a video store and say today, you let my 10-year-old check out anything he wants, you know? I understand why you're anxious about that. And when I starting, you know, on that level of, well, I can understand why you feel this way, but we also need to think about that. I swear sometimes the same people would call into to the radio show and say, well, you know, your guest has a point. My family life was perfect, but the kid down the block, you know, and they could get in touch with memories that they couldn't get in touch with when they were feeling like I was going after them and calling them stupid. So that's what I've learned from this experience about talking about myths.
We have a person over here, Stephanie.
Hello. So we've established that the male breadwinner model of family is less than ideal. So the question that my group and I had was, what facilitated its rise to dominance in American life in the 20th century, if it was in fact inferior to many others?
Well, I wouldn't say that it was inferior to some of the, I mean, it's certainly not inferior to child labor. When we had in the 19th century the protected families of the middle class whose homes were heated by 10 and 12-year-old boys working in the mines and girls in the cotton mills doing the kind of work that their mothers used to have to do, but now were buying from the factories and could devote more time to their kids. So I'm not saying that it wasn't a step forward in some ways, but it was very untraditional because through most of history, women were co-providers with their husbands. They did not have equal rights with their husbands, though. I wouldn't want to romanticize that. Everybody knew colonial women were called meat helps, helpmates, yokemates. Everybody knew that you couldn't run a business without. In fact, the colonial laws said that if a man owned an inn or a tavern, he could not have his license if his wife died until he married again, because he couldn't have run it on his own. So the same thing was true of farms. But at the same time, women had no call on that. And as I said, you got this development of child labor. So the family wage grew out of two kinds of interesting things connecting. One was a new idea about masculine and feminine roles that was actually quite new in history, and that came along with the invention of the love match and the spread of the idea that young men and women should be actually allowed to choose their own mates on the basis of who they were attracted to. This was one of the scariest ideas in the history of humankind. For thousands of years, marriage had been such an important political and economic institution that you weren't going to leave it up to, and it was so important to make connections with wealthy in-laws or with people that you could work with, that you didn't want your kids to, be allowed to choose their mate, especially on such a frivolous reason and short-lived reason often as who they fell in love with. So when the idea began to spread that young people were entitled to make these decisions with the Enlightenment, the rise of wage labor, the American Revolution, the pursuit of happiness, social conservatives of the day were absolutely horrified. They said, oh my God, if we let people do this, how are we going to get them married at all? If my son says, yeah, I don't want to marry, that person. How are we going to get a woman to stay married if she says, well, my husband isn't treating me in a loving way? How are we going to prevent divorce? And one of the psychological ways that they dealt with that was by defining love as the union of opposites. And there was this very gradual process in which males and females used to be considered very similar, but women were just lesser than. In colonial America, there was one of the most popular sermons about wives said, yea, though thou may have greater faculties of mind than thy husband, and be in many respect of greater parts, and have brought more estate with thee at marriage, yet since he is thy husband, the Lord has put him above thee, and you have to obey him. So you may be smarter, you may be stronger, you may be wealthier, but this is the way of the world. Well, now they had this development that men and women were considered to be totally opposite. And women were assigned all of the nurturing, kin-keeping, social skills that men once were involved in. And to men were assigned all of the productive, work-based skills that women were once involved in. And the idea was people will have to marry and they'll have to stay married because you don't have access to any of the skills and resources and even emotions of the other sex unless you do that. So that was part of the idea, that men are the male breadwinners, they're the protectors. The other part was, of course, a reaction among the working class. They saw this ideology developing in the middle class, and the male, so they could take it for their own reasons. You know, there's always a contest over these kinds of ideas. It never just operates for one particular group. And so this idea of the male-female division meant one thing to the middle class, but to the working class it meant, my gosh, maybe I can pull my kids out of the factories. My gosh, maybe I can earn enough so that I can not have my wife have to be in the factory. And gradually, in the course of struggles, union struggles for the 8-hour day, especially with the 1930s struggles and the support they got in terms of getting unions, being a male breadwinner emerged as not only a real step forward to the working class, but a real source of identity and self-respect for working men who had never had that kind of respect before. They became very attached to this. It's been hard to break that down. So that's the origin of it. It did not work well, as you know, for many black Americans. It did not work well for many white women who were not happy with being, especially after you began to get newer forms of labor and so that it wasn't so horribly oppressive to be in the workforce. It wasn't so dangerous. You also got enough comfort level so that you didn't have to be working full-time at home. And so there were lots of things that people then began to decide were not perfect about this arrangement that had once seemed such a victory for working people, and they began to then go against it. And we've seen amazing changes just in the last 40 years in terms of men's beginning to catch up. Women changed first, but men have really made tremendous progress in terms of rethinking their own sense of themselves and of their wives. There's someone over there with a hand up.
Hi. I was wondering if you thought that the modern familial structure or the way it's perceived in modern society benefits capitalism as a system?
Well, you know, it's always hard to say. I mean, clearly, some people say, well, it was invented to help capitalism. That's always much too simplistic an explanation of anything. Certainly the nuclear family structure, the fact that we have such an emphasis on everybody having their own little private possessions and not, for example, sharing cars or sharing lawn mowers is a benefit to the consumer society. On the other hand, there are many things that are contradictory. For example, as you get families that have spend more time with their children, that have more sense that love should be an association of equals, you get more demands that women join the labor force. This, in one way, encourages productivity and contributes to the gross national product of capitalism. On the other hand, it certainly also stimulates demands for childcare, for limits on the work week, and for family-friendly work policies, which are not always in the interest of particular corporations or particular businesses, even if they are in the long-term economic interest of a nation and of its being able to reproduce its population. So it's a complicated thing. Really, I don't think there's any particular family form that is either pro or anti-capitalist. It's a question of what kinds of social support systems we work for.
Stephanie, over here. Stephanie?
Oh, sorry.
Hi. So we were curious about extending the conversation to a cross-cultural perspective, and we were wondering about, America being a country of immigrants, any American myths that may have derived from other cultures, or any American myths that may have imposed on other cultures?
Well, we are a nation of immigrants. We have, one of the things that we find is that although many immigrant communities do sustain strong extended family ties and community ties, there is a certain homogenizing effect in family behaviors, you know. Some of it good, that women from immigrant communities gain freedoms often that they did not have in other communities in their homeland, but other parts of it bad, and that more collective values get undermined. I don't know that we've adopted. I think that sometimes that immigrants themselves make up myths about their past, that they highlight some aspect of their past that wasn't that important in the homeland in order to either resist or accommodate to their position in this new society. So it's, again, a very complicated process. I'm not sure if you have any particular myths that you wanted me to pursue. There's lots of hands.
Hi. So we talked a bit about pride, and we're wondering where the shame in asking for help or handouts comes from, and if maybe there's a difference in gender when it comes to asking for handouts.
Well, this is a very good example of a cross-cultural difference, but that we sometimes misinterpret as a non-Western, as a contrast between Western values and other values. But in fact, it was deeply embedded in the Western tradition as well. In most pre-industrial societies, people understand that they depend upon the larger group, and reciprocity is a very important part of society, and you accept the fact that you are dependent for some parts of your life, and there will be people dependent on you. The new ideology that independence is the key began to develop with the development of wage labor and with the political revolutions that accompanied that, many of which were very progressive, because the dependence of feudal Europe is probably best summed up in the medieval cathedrals, which show lords standing on the backs of serfs, you know. So there was something progressive about saying, no, you should have a contract society, you should be independent. But one of the things that I discuss in the original version of my book is the extent to which, with the further development of the market economy, we began to take some of the progressive parts of it, that contracts are independent of your personal relationships, and should not be, you know, should not be manipulated on the basis of dependence or independence, but that began to deny any sense that they should also fulfill some form of justice. Eventually, we got the idea that a contract was by definition fair, even if the people had to enter into it for very different reasons. And so you got this development that accompanied the Enlightenment and the political revolutions, and there was a very kind of two-sided thing that had some progressive elements, but that has, I think, morphed into a situation where it is just totally out of touch with the understanding that all societies in the past have had, and that is that we are dependent on each other. There's no such thing as a self-made man starting from biology, you know. There's lots up here.
Hi. This question is because we have a lot of students here. You mentioned that it took a lot of years to write your first book, and could you tell us a little bit about your research process? Because it sounded like you didn't have to take quite so much time to write the following books. Do you have a system? Do you just collect information? Do independent studies, things like that?
Well, my first book, The Social Origins of Private Life, took me 13 years to write. I now think you could call it as pompous as you want to be. It was, I was trying to prove myself to other academics. I never used a dime word if I had a $1 in my pocket, and I, footnoted it up the gazoo. Fortunately, though, I did so much work that when I finished it and started looking at what had happened to debates about family life in the process of writing it, it then only took me, that came out in '88, it only took me 4 years to do my next book, The Way We Never Were, because I was drawing on all that history, but changing it around and using parts of it that I hadn't used before, and then updating it with contemporary. But it's never taken me since then less than 5 years to write a book. I'm pretty compulsive about research. I'm pretty, I work, I like to work. I like, I don't always like the writing process, but I spend a lot of time on the books. And, I'll go to original sources when I can. I read other people's books. One of the joys of working at Evergreen has been to be exposed to so many other disciplines so that I know where to look for other journals. And then for the past, since 1995, I've been involved with the Council on Contemporary Families, which is an association of family researchers and practitioners that got formed when a bunch of us would meet. We'd be keynoting conferences, and we'd go out for a cup of coffee, or often in my case, a glass of wine, and start complaining that the press was calling on all these groups, these ideological think tanks that had no researchers on their staff at all, but who just kind of cherry-picked evidence. And we thought, well, we should really find a way to get our research out. So it's all volunteers. We've never had been funded by anyone. We all do this on top of our otherwise busy lives, but we have this collection of the most generous and talented family researchers in the country. And one of my jobs, unpaid, would be just really ideal if it was paid, as the director of research, is that they send me the abstracts of all of their forthcoming articles, because I help them then decide whether this is something that we should tell the press about, and I'll help them edit it into a form that is popular or into an op-ed piece. So it's a kind of win-win situation. I can help them get their research out, but I know the research that's coming because they're sending it to me. So I'm very lucky that way.
We've got one.
We've got somebody back here, and then you got two over here whose hands have been up for a long time.
Hi, our group came up with a question. How does the idea of self-reliance play into the stigma we have of mental illness?
Well, I think that Americans, the other side of self-reliance is that Americans are also quite willing, I think, to do a lot of blaming of parents, and mothers get blamed a lot for things. And so there's some acceptance that mental illness is an illness that can't, that you're not reliable. We just don't have any that you can't be expected to be self-reliant. But we don't have any in-between things. We don't have this kind of ability to think through how we can help people be reliant in limited ways and still be dependent and be seen as productive members of society. Then on top of that, of course, we had one of these reactions against a real abuse, and that was the tremendous over-institutionalization of mentally ill. And I worked for a while at Child Study Treatment Center up at Western State Hospital, and there were kids in there who basically, teenagers, had ended up being committed for just acting out, being normal teenagers, and then it escalated because they were acting out against the commitment, and they were there for years and years and years. So there was a reaction against that let them out, but that coincided with the tax revolt of the 1970s, and that made it cheaper to just let everybody go. So you've had this tremendous problem with, so many of the homeless are mentally ill. So many of the people in jail are mentally ill, and we do not have a system to deal with them except to just take them out, either to leave them alone and make them, let them beg on the street corners and occasionally flip out, or to institutionalize them in incarceration places where they're not getting any help. It's terrible.
Ms. Coontz, my name is Brendan Kloss, and speaking of mental illness, I have Asperger's syndrome, in addition to being a Christian and half Korean, half American. After hearing some of your, in your seminar about the family and economy situation, and how government usually interfere with our normal lives, the question is in what ways and how can our families be better without government interference? Because, just to clarify, the government usually meddle affairs in everyone's lives but the rich. It's always they always attack the poor and the middle class, but I never seen any of them trying to tax heavily on the rich, not even 1 cent towards them. That's all I ask. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I don't know that the government meddles a lot anymore in the lives of poor and working class people. What it does is it engages in destructive neglect by not helping to build the support systems that that people need in order to be able to have the confidence and stability that allows a family to work well. And they do give that. When we were just talking in one of the smaller groups, that one of the ways that that we use the myth of self-reliance is that we smuggle our subsidies to the rich in the form of tax deductions, tax expenditures. Well, those are just as much spending as direct expenditures. If I owe the government $500 and the government says, I'm going to forgive that debt, then that's as much a deduction from the Treasury as spending that $500 on something else. But it's harder to explain to people, and it's harder to have a real debate about those because they're being smuggled in to the budget. And it's gotten to the point where, the top 20% of the population get well over 70% of the benefits from these kinds of tax expenditures. And they can even, the Supreme Court even ruled that since these are not real spending, it's okay for the government to give these tax deductions to religious schools, for example, because it doesn't violate church and state, even though they couldn't directly spend it. So there are all sorts of these kinds of problems that we have to address by bringing these issues out into the open. There's someone up here who's had a...
Our group wanted to know, as we transition into a global internet community.
Hold the mic a little closer.
Our group wanted to know, as we transition into a global internet community, are we becoming suspicious of the private family man once more?
That's a very good question that probably your generation is better equipped to answer than I. There's a lot of debate about the impact of the internet, and I think, like most inventions, there's good and bad uses. We can see some really, really interesting and good forms of social mobilization. For example, in the response to the earthquake in Haiti, the first responders did it through Twitter. And but we can also see, I confess that when I look down and I see 3 young people all texting on their phone instead of talking to each other, I worry very much that we are, in fact, becoming nations of loners and not just nuclear families.
You have a question over here?
Yes.
Can we learn something positive about the role of myths from looking at the ancient world and how they, how myths, the role that myths played in their societies?
Well, I grew up on Greek myths and enjoyed them, but can we learn something positive? It seems to me that a lot of the Greek myths that I grew up with were justifications of arbitrariness in the world. There are other myths that many less complex band-level societies have myths that definitely reinforce reciprocity, that essentially argue, that reinforce the idea that if you take something, you owe something in return. So yes, one can build myths. Certainly, we know that in families, some families can construct myths. I know that, sometimes you can get a myth going about something that was a routine that's only happened once, but that manages to build family solidarities just by repeating it over and over again. And I suppose we could, in the modern world, try to collectively construct some of those. I think that's what novelists do very often. But too often, at least in stratified societies, myths serve, wherever they arise, they begin to be deformed to serve the interests, or at least not to undermine the interests of particular dominant groups.
We have one up here.
Hi. About a year ago, I reread The Feminine Mystique, and since then, I've had a lot of difficulty accepting the pressures that I felt that are very similar to what Betty Friedan talks about in her novel. And I was wondering what you feel is the most prevalent myth about femininity or women that's presented today.
Well, I personally think that we've come a huge, long way since Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, that a lot of what she describes, and very accurately, as the dominant cultural motif about women, that women were considered to be, that girls were told that they mustn't act like boys, that they mustn't, that you shouldn't be able to throw a ball, that they should play dumb to catch a man, that they would get all of their fulfillment in being a wife and mother, and only a particular kind of wife and mother. I think there are some subcultures and parts of America where you still get these messages for young women. But overall, I think that these kinds of messages are gone, that most young women are being told you can be anything that you want. In fact, I think that one of that perhaps slower to change has been the myths of masculinity. A friend of mine did one of the CCFers did a really interesting study of middle schoolers, and she found that the girls no longer felt that there was any activity that was unfeminine to engage in. They could play sports, they could do this, they could, the one strong myth, and stronger than the 60s, and I think very destructive, was the sexy myth, the hottie myth. But aside from that, they didn't feel that any activity that you could play ball with the boys, you could run like a guy, you could be smart. They didn't feel any restrictions about that. The young men, on the other hand, did not feel comfortable embracing any of the activities that used to be associated with girls. And I think that really one of the next frontiers of the gender revolution is to take on the masculine mystique just as strongly as we've been taking on the feminine mystique, to be just as assertive about bringing men back into the family and into the home as we have been about bringing women into the workforce, because the two have to work together. One of the biggest barriers, one of the biggest sources of gender discrimination in pay now is not the blatant discrimination that used to be for the same work, the same hours. Young women who are childless earn 96% of men who work the same hours and the same jobs at this point. The 77 thing, it makes it convenient that women make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes. It's, excuse me, but it's a BS statistic. It does not take into account different college majors, different hours worked, different times off from the job. It's just not, I understand why people are doing it, but it's not helpful to misuse a statistic like that. The real gender discrimination takes place in a much more subtle way than it used to, and that is that it's women, that it's a caregiving penalty. Anybody who does caregiving is penalized, and it's still women who are pressured to and feel pressured to do the caregiving, and men who get penalized if they don't. It's very interesting. If you look, we used to think that there was a fatherhood penalty, and if you look at a statistic, on average there is, that when women become mothers, they start earning less. They are, even when they don't take time off, they are less likely to be promoted because the employer assumes that a woman is going to put her family first. Men get a bonus because the employer assumes that the men are going to put their work first, and that since their wife will probably quit work, they'll be working even more hours. But that bonus is totally contingent upon the man doing that. We now know that when men ask for family-friendly work policies or take them, they face the same sorts of discrimination that women face. So we have to take both of these on at once. And I think that for women, there's been a real shift in the kind of mystiques. I think one of the big mystiques now is the haughty mystique, the idea that, yes, you can do anything a man does, but you got to be sexy doing it. For men, of course, it's the old idea that you cannot act like a girl. That's, and it starts really, really young. Don't cry, be a man, man up, step up to the plate. And I think that we don't sometimes realize how many the pressures are. I was in a meeting last year, and the men and women running it asked a really interesting series of questions. They said, first of all, how many women in this room have ever walked to your car at night and looked in the back of the car to see if there's anyone there? Go on, let's everybody raise your. How many men have ever done that? Couple, none in this other one. But you see the gender difference. Now, how many men in this room have ever been afraid that you would be asked to fight and die for your country? How many women have been afraid of that? See? Huge gender differences there that still occur. And we have to understand those gender differences and work to overcome them, I think.
Okay. In your opinion, what do you think it will take for American culture and I guess society at large to really acknowledge its pains and wounds and ultimately the reliance on the myth of self-reliance as kind of, I guess, like a psychological mask to cover these social wounds? Like, what will it take?
Well, I think we're seeing some of it right now in two very extreme ways. The two very anti-establishment figures that are gaining ground. Trump, on the one hand, and Sanders on the other, both of whom seem to be appealing to people who feel that government is not working for them, the economy is not working for them. Of course, they lead to very different conclusions. And really, one of the advantages of being a historian, and an older historian at that, is to be able to say it really depends on you people what you help people do with that feeling that they're just beginning to get that this system is not working for them.
Our group's question was, what period of time is Donald Trump talking about when he says, "Make America great again"?
Well, I'm about to write an op-ed piece on the pangs of nostalgia that I sometimes feel that I was talking about. But because, of course, what he's talking about, I think, is the time when we came out of World War II, the only industrial power that had not had its infrastructure stripped, when we were the only ones with the bomb, when we could get away with what we wanted in the world, when 6% of the world's population could use 51% of the world's resources. We could dictate terms to everybody. Yeah, eventually we had to look out for the Russians. But basically, that was a period when America could do what it wanted in the world. It came to an end in Vietnam. They called it the Vietnam Syndrome. It took them 20 years to cure America of that syndrome and to go back into the interventionist mode. So that's what I think he's talking about. And what he forgets is that period, not only, I don't think he forgets that that period was based on racism and anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-female sentiment. That doesn't seem to bother him. But what he forgets that I think would bother him is that that was a period when the union, as I said, the union membership was 3 times higher than today. Wages were rising right in hand with productivity. We were investing more in infrastructure than we were in financial speculation and wheeling dealing and the kinds of phony kinds of bankruptcies that he goes through all the time, speaking of somebody who takes handouts from the government. And that the Supreme Court only was ruling for business interests 40% of the time instead of the 61% of the time that it's been ruling for business interests under those Roberts leadership. So he forgets a lot about that, but that's what I think he'd like. He'd like to cherry pick history so that he could go back to that particular power without any of the things that undergirded it.
We have one over here, Stephanie.
Hi. You said you don't like the term white privilege and fearing for white people's sensitivities. Many white people have been similarly offended by the Black Lives Matter movement. So at what point does tiptoeing around white people's feelings become detrimental to the urgency of confronting racism and privilege in America?
Well, I don't think that I'm tiptoeing around white people's feelings or ever have in my writings and my claim that most of the differences that you find come from racism. I just think that it's important, and I certainly wouldn't tiptoe around them on the Black Lives Matter. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy. For anybody to say all lives matter as though there was no, of course all lives matter, but that's a stupid cop-out to the challenge that is being made about the undervaluing of black lives, and nothing, as I said earlier, shows this more clearly than the standoff at the Oregon place where they've built barricades and are taunting the FBI and waving guns around, and nobody's done done anything about it. So you can take that on. You should also take on the fact, though, that I think it's very important that the Black Lives Matter people also go out when a poor white guy gets killed by the cops, as there was one a couple of months ago. It's very important to make that solidarity, to show white working class people that it is not in their interest to collude with this kind of racism. So that's why I love the Black Lives Matter slogan, and I don't like the white privilege slogan, because not all whites see themselves as living privileged lives, especially in a period when their wages have been falling, their job security has increased, when they are dying now of drug overdoses, and experiencing the same kinds of disintegration in community that blacks have had to deal with for many, many years. There should be some solidarity there, even as we point out that there are still white advantages. So that's the difference. I don't think it's tiptoeing. I think that it's important, though, that we absolutely understand that you don't build a movement out of making people feel that, that they're not wanted in the movement. We want to make them feel wanted and needed, and that they should abandon their racism to get there.
Hi. So you've had a lot of information, and so our group was kind of just wondering if you could enlighten us on, do you recall what year it was when any kind of any form of government assistance came along, and what it might have been like for people that had no help whatsoever, for the people that had they just didn't have jobs, anything like that? What was it like at that time, and what year was it when government assistance popped in? What was it like for people that had no help?
Well, it was absolutely horrible. You know, I mean, there have been real improvements. I think it's very important that we recognize that despite our criticisms of the limits, that there have been very big improvements. They started, I mean, some of the first beginnings were started with the Civil War pensions, which made a big difference. And then in the early 20th century, you began to get aid to single mothers, although it was very much contaminated by the fact that you had to be considered a fit mother, and you can imagine the racist and cultural kinds of prejudices that went into deciding whether you were a fit mother. The first big step forward came with the New Deal. In the Depression, when people began to realize that you had to actually begin to create jobs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Youth Corps, and you had to begin to invest in creating those jobs and giving help to people, building camps that fed people, that could house them. The next big step came with the war on poverty, and the war on poverty had some limits, but it's very important to recognize that before the war on poverty, there were most people in this country who were not in the middle class never had seen a dentist. They did not get good medical care. They were much more malnutrition than we see today. So, despite the fact that that the war on poverty did not wipe out poverty, despite the fact that there's been these attacks on the war on poverty, things like the supplemental nutrition program, the food stamps, they've all been huge, huge benefits for people. They just haven't kept up with what the rest of the industrial, wealthy world has been doing, who have made much better strides in being able to accommodate, and this is what's ironic, they create more individual social mobility, more social reliance by providing a bigger floor and a stronger floor and a higher up floor for people to start from. And that's really one of the big tragedies of America, where we led the world in public education once. Now, like we're 24th. We led the world in some sorts of pensions. Now we're way behind what other countries are doing. The same thing with work-family policy. We're debating paid leave every other other country has not only, every other wealthy country now has mandated paid maternity leave, and most of them have paid paternity leave as well. Okay. You guys decide how.
Maybe a couple more questions? There's one here. We'll let you find it out.
Okay, I'm ready. All right, so some of your work that you've done talks about single mom families. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the rate of divorce and the impact of this on our family ideas in America, and what the future family ideas look like for Americans. And I'm a happily divorced woman, so I'd just like to know what that looks like.
Okay. Well, we know that, I mean, first of all, there's a couple of different types of single moms. There are single moms that were never married, and then there are moms who are divorced. There's also in growing numbers of single dads, whether divorced or raising kids themselves. Certainly not a high enough proportion, but growing numbers of them. What do we know about it? We know that there are big challenges associated, especially in our country, with raising a kid alone, because we don't have good work policies, because we don't have good support systems. It really helps to have a second person around, just to help earn money, to help spell you in terms of time, to share the childcare, to share the chauffeuring around, and on a personal level too, to compensate when you're just too tired to respond patiently to your kid. You know, I think that's a reality, that a good collaborating partnership with someone, whether it's a romantic partnership or not, we know is a help. But we also know that an educated single parent who has resources, who can get extra help, does not doom the kids in any way, and is certainly going to be better off than in a very miserable marriage, because we know that women in miserable marriages are more likely to drink, they're more likely to have maternal depression. Those are big risk factors for kids. So these are always trade-offs. But there's a new study out that really breaks it down and shows that, yes, that the average behavior difficulties and educational difficulties that are found, and they're very small, by the way, in divorced families and single-parent families, are all associated with low income and less education. So that getting an education is probably the best thing you can do. That predicts your child's outcome much better than your marital status. The other important thing to recognize about averages is that they obscure trends that often go in the opposite direction. We've really got to get past, with today's family diversity, talking about averages, and look at different tendencies that may, in fact, the average may not describe the tendency for anyone. There's a real recent study, for example, of kids of divorce, and they found that that the vast majority had no extra problems educationally or behavior. But that, let's see, I may get these wrong. I don't have the exact figures with me right now. But, for example, 18% of kids experienced an increase in behavior problems and externalizing and bullying after a divorce, but 14% of them experienced a decrease in that. And then the rest experienced no difference. So these things get greatly exaggerated. There's challenges in all sorts of family arrangements. If you've got a couple, same-sex couple or heterosexual couple who gets along well and who can collaborate and model good decision-making skills, that's obviously a big advantage for a kid. But if you don't, it can be a worse problem for the kid than a single-parent family.
One more.
Okay.
Can you speak to some of the myths and the racism that Native American families experience today?
Well, yes. you've got several. Some of the same Native Americans, of course. You've got some who live on reservations where there is at least some tribal solidarity, but also often, they've been pushed onto reservations that are extremely poor, and you have all sorts of difficulties there because of the lack of the income. And of course, you get the prejudices in two sides. You get the ones from the liberals who idealize Native American families as though, they were always the stewards of the world and they should save the world with their ideals. And that's not. Nobody should be burdened with that kind of myth either. And then you get the ones of the lazy ones, the drunks, all of these kinds of things that ignore the tremendous pressures that are not only because of the low income, but also because of the systematic destruction of a way of life that has occurred in the United States when the government went in and destroyed the communal family systems, broke up the power of women in the families, introduced a form of Christianity that said men were the boss, which was not the traditional way in most Native American communities, insisted that they have private allotments, and then took the kids away, cut their hair, and forced them to take English names and speak the English language and not their own. That kind of loss of a whole culture is more devastating than just individual poverty. And the inability of so many white Americans to understand that is very difficult. But I want to give you one final interesting, it reminds me of something where, we in America, we always say you can't throw money at a problem, that's counterproductive. Well, actually, throwing money at a problem is often very helpful. And your question reminded me of a lovely natural experiment that that occurred when in a Cherokee area, when these researchers had many families who lived in this area that were very, very poor, both Indian and non-Indian. But when a profitable casino opened on the reservation, every household with an Indian member got an extra $4,000 a year. And they found that money, given without conditions, they could have spent it on alcohol, they could have spent it on tobacco. That money, especially if it went to the mom, got spent on education, got spent on food. It actually, there's another study that shows that when families get this unconditional income, they actually decrease their expenditures on alcohol and tobacco, because alcohol and tobacco are ways that people respond to stress. They're not healthy stress reducers, but they are a way of doing it. And with more money, they were less likely to even do that. So yeah, they can solve these problems. Maybe you can't solve them entirely with money. You have to combine it with some training, some social services, but you can't solve it just by preaching at people without giving them that security. I have a friend in the Council on Contemporary Family, a psychologist, who shows that who's done a lot of research that shows that negative interactions between couples are much more predicted by financial insecurity and fear than they are by the parents, by the childhood of those kids, whether they had parental divorce, whatever it was. And he makes this analogy. He says, if you just teach people relationship skills and you don't give them concrete ways that relieve their stress, it's like giving them piano lessons, but then sending them home and telling them to practice piano on the tabletop because they don't have a piano. It's not really going to stick very well.
Any concluding remarks or questions?
I'm pretty tired. I expect you're pretty tired. It's just really lovely to interact with Evergreen students and Evergreen grads and a community like this, so thanks for having me.